still in John, and we get to a story that is unique to the Gospel of John. This does not appear in the other Gospels, so it has a special place here. Al's killing me with the PowerPoint. I mean, I'm not this creative, so you got to understand. This is Al, and he's doing just a tremendous job here. But this is another one of those I am statements, and we'll pick it up as we go through it. Now, a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, a village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sister sent word to Jesus, "Lord, the one you love is sick." When he heard this, Jesus said, "This sickness will not end into death. No, it is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it." Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Yet when he heard Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. Then he said to his disciples, "Let us go back to Judea." You'd think an innocent statement. "But Rabbi," they said, a short while ago the Jews were trying to stone you, and yet you want to go back there?" Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? A man who walks by day will not stumble, for he sees by the world's light. It is when he walks by night that he stumbles, for he has no light." After he had said this, he went on to tell them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to wake him up." His disciples replied, "Lord, if he sleeps, he'll get better." Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep. So then he told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead. And for your sake, I'm glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." I'd be pretty confused if I was one of the disciples at this point. Then Thomas, called Didymus, said to the rest of the disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. "Lord," Martha said to Jesus, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live, and even though he dies. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die." Got to work through that one. "Do you believe this?" "Yes, Lord," she told him, "I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who has come into the world." This is before the crucifixion. And after she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. "The teacher is here," she said, "and he is asking for you." When Mary heard this, she got up and quickly went to him. Now Jesus had not entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house, comforting her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. And Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of a blind man have kept this man from dying?" And again, this is one of those unique stories. We're familiar with it, but the fact is it only appears in John. This is a unique story to John. And it tells us a lot about where John's coming from. That starts off with, a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet. We all know that story. It was where the Pharisee said, boy, if he knew who was wiping his feet, he wouldn't let her. And it's one of those things where it's very unique, but apparently everyone already knew the story about Mary. So as John's telling this story, he seems to be aware that no one knows who Lazarus is at this point. But that everyone knows who Mary is at this point. And so he throws in that little snippet. He's not even going to tell the Mary story until the next chapter, but he knows everyone already knows that one. And so it's mentioned in Mark 14, and it apparently was famous. Jesus said, everywhere the gospel is preached, what she has done for me will be told. And apparently by the time John writes John, everyone knows that. The story has been told many, many times. And what you get the sense in this that we don't pick up from the other Gospels is that Jesus was close to these people. These were not acquaintances. These were not one-time meetings. These were not little things. Apparently, Jesus hung out with Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. That they were intimate friends of his. People he was very close to. And we don't get that from the other Gospels. Now you can imagine if you were close friends with Jesus, who walked around healing people and performing miracles, and your brother got sick, you send word to Jesus. I mean, you've seen him heal all sorts of people. Your brother's really sick. It looks pretty serious. Let's just get Jesus here. I mean, we can solve this problem. And so they sent word. And Jesus makes this comment, this sickness will not end in death. And you kind of wonder, doesn't Jesus know what's, but yes, he does, but he knows a whole lot more. A whole lot more than we see. And he says, no, it's for God's glory that God's Son may be glorified through it. It's one of those things where the way the text is written, it's very clear that Jesus knew Lazarus was about to die and deliberately waited until he died before he went to see him. And we think, why would he do that? If you work through it theologically, you realize if he had been there when Lazarus was just sick, he would have healed him. How could he not heal him? But he knew there's something bigger going on here. He knew everyone had already seen him heal people, and still they were not yet convinced of who he was. And so he thought, this is going to take a little more work. There's still a lot of people that aren't truly convinced. They're just looking for a miracle worker when I'm trying to get them to see I'm the Son of God. And so he waits. And he doesn't just wait, one day. It says he waits a couple days, and then it still took another couple days to get there. So that by the time he gets there, Lazarus has been in the grave 4 days. Now, if someone dies and you show up an hour later and raise him from the dead, you could think, well, maybe he wasn't really dead. Maybe he was just in a coma. Maybe he just, deep sleep. Or like the movie says, maybe he was just mostly dead, but not all dead. But let me tell you, after 4 days, he's all dead. And in fact, according to them, he was getting a little ripe at that point. So Jesus waits, and he waits for a reason, with some very specific goals in mind. And this ought to help us a little when we see sickness and death, because we are surrounded by sickness and death, are we not? We have people that we are currently praying for right now who are struggling in life and death struggles with illness. And it's something that's ever present, and it hurts. It's something we don't fully understand. I honestly believe that God did not create us for death, that death came as a result of sin in the world, and that there's something in us that knows that, so that even now we fear death, we get away from death, we hate death, because that's not the way we were created. And so when we have to constantly deal with death, because you always hear people, oh, well, that's just part of life. Well, it's become part of life. But that's never what God intended for us. And so that's why I think death is still a struggle, even for people who know God. Because there's something in us that knows that that's not right. And we see this, and Jesus says, he's sick and dying. And again, some of us have Job's friends problems, Oh, he's sick and dying, must have done something wrong. There must be some secret sin we all don't know about. What do you think it was? We have that feeling. It's like if bad things happen to you, you must have done something bad. You deserved it. And Jesus makes a point here. He says, no, my friend that I love deeply is sick and dying so that God may be glorified. We need to think about that when we face tough life situations. That it might not be that, because I've had people come in my office and say, God hates me. I'll tell you, you want to tick me off? Just say that. Because that's just not true. Jesus died on the cross to make sure that question is fully answered forever and ever. Amen. And so when tough things happen to us, this idea that, well, God's just out to get me. Or God's just abandoned me. And I even find that more far-fetched. I loved it when the Jews were screaming, they were in Babylon. And God has forgotten us. God, He's just left us, so all these terrible things have happened to us. And I love, you got to love prophets. He says, no, that's not true. What do you mean? God didn't let these things happen to you. He did them to you. You did deserve this. And worse. But you've never been out of God's hands. He never abandoned you. And so I can imagine as Mary and Martha sat there next to their brother who was dying, I can see them thinking, why hasn't Jesus come? If He was here, this suffering could stop. And how difficult that must have been for them. But God's going to use Lazarus' illness and death as a way to glorify His Son and bring many new believers into the extended community of love that God intended from the beginning. When you heard Lazarus sick, He holds off, but then He says, well, okay, he's dead. What I need to do is about to get done. Let's go back there. And I love the disciples for several reasons. Number one, they're never shy about telling stories that make them look like idiots. They're the ones telling the stories. And he's like, let's go back to Judea. And they're like, I don't know if you remember some recent history here, Jesus, but, last time we were there, the rocks, the people trying to kill us. Are you sure you want to, maybe you forgot. The last 4 times we've been there, they tried to kill us. You remembering any of this? And, it's like, did Jesus forget? And, Jesus is just, well, brother, And so he goes into the bit about, you got to walk in the light. He's basically, trying to explain that, I got a job to do. The disciples are very hesitant. They know the tension is thick. They feel something coming. They're hoping it's the political revolution to throw the Romans out. They're anticipating that, but they're a little nervous about Jesus getting killed before that can happen. Shows a kind of misunderstanding of who the Messiah is all the way around that. But He's got a clear job to do, and He's going to do it, and He's like, we do it in the daylight. I'm not here to hide. I'm here to bring salvation to the world. And I'm not going to shy away from that, and I'm not going to sneak around and do that. He's going to do the job, no matter what. And here's where I love this verse, because I think doubting Thomas has gotten a bad rap. It talks about how, well, if I can't touch his side and see this, then I'm not going to believe. And if I were there and everyone else saw it but me, I think I'd have the same feeling, Well, if he's really alive, then I need to see him. But here we see some faith on his part, or maybe some gallows humor, I don't know. But he's, well, okay, he wants to go back and die. I guess we better go die with him, And they get up and go. And they're all very aware, just hanging out with Jesus could get you killed. When they start throwing stones at him and you're standing next to him, there's a good chance someone might rock your world too, And so he's like, let's go. Let's go. Let's go and die with him. Little did he know how true those words would become. But here we find the real passion in the story. She hears Jesus coming. She doesn't wait for him to get to the house. She runs outside the village. She says, Lord, Martha. Martha said to Jesus, if you'd been here, if you had just been here, my brother wouldn't have died. And you need to put yourself in that situation. These are people that Jesus is close to, people that love Jesus, people who listen to Jesus. They've seen the miracles. They've seen all the stuff he does. And this is really a pretty awesome statement. She's not mad at him. A lot of people, when they lose someone, they get mad at God. She's not mad at Jesus. She actually makes this tremendous, if you had been here, he would not have died. But I know, even now, God will give you whatever you ask. You think about that statement in that time period, under those circumstances. She'd seen him heal people. She'd seen Jesus do miracles. She knew he could have prevented his brother from dying, but he didn't. But now she's saying, I still know. And see, this is a step up from everybody else there. I still know God will do whatever you ask. We need to get there. We need to understand that God does not forget us. God does not abandon us. And when we're in the midst of a horrible trial that we just don't understand and don't think is fair and think is absolutely awful, we need to recognize God is allowing this, perhaps for his future glory. That he's not being mean. He's not being negligent. He's not being incompetent. He has a plan that we just don't know about, nor can we understand at this point. And he's going to see us through it. And then we get this great statement. Jesus, and again, you sort of look at it from Jesus' perspective. He sees the sadness, he sees the suffering, and yet he knows something she doesn't know. He says, your brother's going to rise again. And she says, well, she thought, well, he must be speaking theologically now as the rabbi. I know he will rise in the resurrection on the last day. And Jesus said, do you know I am the resurrection of the life? He who believes in me will live even though he dies. And whoever lives and believes in me will never, never die. Do you believe this? And you know what? This is really amazing. This is really an amazing statement. He says, I am the resurrection and the life. If you believe in me, you will never die. Do you believe this? And she doesn't say, yes, I believe you're the resurrection and the life. Yes, I believe that if I believe in you, I will never die. She says, yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God. I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God. That is the Christian confession of faith before there were any Christians. Jesus had gotten it out of Peter. But the only other person we hear it from before the resurrection is Martha. That she clearly has a grip that nobody else seems to have yet. Very few had that understanding. And she makes this great statement, but Jesus is making an interesting comment on life and death here. You need to read this carefully. He who believes in me will live even though he dies. And you think, okay, that doesn't make any sense. Well, not from a worldly standpoint. But God doesn't see death as the end. He didn't create us for death, and even though death came as a result of sin, he still said that's not it. We're gonna provide a way out, that even though you die, you will live. And the option is going to be yours. It's pretty interesting, because first he says, you'll live even if you die, and then he'll say, if you believe in me, you won't even die. And so he's speaking eternally, obviously, not in a physical standpoint. But Martha makes this great, it's just really fascinating. She gets it in a way that nobody else does. I believe you are the Christ. Can we say that together? I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God. That's the foundation that we stand on. That's the foundation that the church is built on. That is the link from the Old Testament to the New Testament and into eternity with God. I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God. Well, they get Mary. And she says the same thing. She comes out, Jesus has already gone through this scene with Martha, and Mary comes out and says, if you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died. And this is really powerful too. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. And this is one of those, I get frustrated with translators sometimes because they feel like they have to make Jesus not human. When if you read this, and again, I know some people don't like it when you bring up the Greek, but the fact of the matter is you read the Greek here, and it says he was shaking. He was trembling with emotion, trembling with compassion. And the translators have to go, he was deeply moved and troubled. That's not the scene that's being described here. And I get this. I got to tell you, I get this. I do funerals quite often, unfortunately. And I go and do funerals for people I don't know. But when I stand there in front of the crowd and share scriptures, share words of comfort and encouragement, and I see the emotion in the room, I'm moved. It brings tears to my eyes, and I never knew them. I don't even know the people in the room. But I can feel them. I can feel the suffering. And Jesus feels it. This was someone he loved, but I don't think Jesus is all worked up about Lazarus. He came there to raise him from the dead. He knew that. And then even though they're like, oh, look how he loved him. It's like, no, I think there must be Jesus trembling with compassion, with sadness, was not because of Lazarus. It was because of Mary and Martha and the rest of the crowd. He was deeply moved not because of Lazarus. And again, this, I remember as a kid, everyone knew this verse. Because at Sunday school it said, come next week with a memory verse, and everyone knew Jesus wept. Shortest verse in the Bible. And it was one of the first memorized verses for all children raised in, BRC squared. If you were raised in the Church of Christ, you had to have a memory verse. Everyone knew this was the go-to verse. Jesus wept. Did it? But here again, in Greek, it says Jesus burst into tears. there was a flood of emotion. And again, the translators feel like, oh, that looks like he has uncontrolled emotion. We can't have that. I think what this story is trying to tell us, what John's trying to make very clear to everybody was, yes, he was the Son of God. And yes, he was fully human. He had feelings just like us. He understands us. And let me warn you just ahead of time, when you get to heaven, don't try to say, God, you don't understand. That was the whole point. He understands perfectly. He wasn't crying over Lazarus. He was moved by the pain and suffering in the room. He was moved by the pain and suffering that death brings, which came as a result of sin in our lives. And let me tell you, when you are suffering, most likely it's not that God's doing it to you, that it's you did it to yourself. At least that's been my experience. You know, we can always try to blame somebody else, and modern psychology seems to think that's healthy, because, blame someone else for all of your problems. I talked to a counselor about, boy, I'm really struggling with my focus. How long have you hated your mother? I'm not talking about a focus problem here, but blame somebody else and you'll feel better. The fact of the matter is the pain and suffering we bring into the world is a result of our own sin. And God, in spite of knowing that, is moved to tears. Because even if we deserve it, even if we own it, it hurts him. Like any good parent, it hurts him to see his children hurt. This tells us a lot about who God is. And we need to get this part too. This is a loving Father, not some distant God. That one kills me. I was like, oh my gosh, I just had to stop there for a while. Conclusion, then the Jews said, see how he loved him. They were misunderstood the whole thing. But some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? There were some who were, if all this suffering and even his own suffering apparently could have been avoided, why didn't he? John's telling us here, again, at the end of all these scenes, he gives us the crowd's reaction. And, some thought, wow, he loved him, but others were, touched by his compassion for the crowd. Others were thinking, what? If he's a healer, why didn't he show up and heal? If he was so close to this family, if he cared about Mary and Martha, why did he show up? And there's a lot more going on here. You get into the background of all this, but the fact of the matter is, Lazarus was the man in the family. The parents were apparently dead, and Mary and Martha needed to have a man in the family to represent them, even if they were going to get married or to provide for them or to get jobs or whatever. Their standing in the community would be greatly diminished. Their opportunities for survival, for provision, would greatly diminish without Lazarus. It was sort of like, if the only son of a widow dies, she kind of loses everything. Well, when Lazarus dies, Mary and Martha are stuck. There's a reason Jesus shows up here. Not just to raise him from the dead, but raising Lazarus from the dead isn't just a great miraculous sign that glorifies God and glorifies the Son. It puts food on the table for Mary and Martha. And so they're like, why wouldn't he have showed up? Everyone had seen him do these things. And they're starting to wonder, maybe he's not the one. We thought he was. A lot of people talking about it, but if he couldn't even take care of his own friend, take care of these two fine ladies that he seems to care about, if he couldn't take care of them, maybe he's not the Messiah that we're waiting for. They knew he could have healed him. But now that he's in the grave 4 days, what could Jesus do? That's what they were thinking. If he showed up while he was still alive, he had something to work with. But now that he's in the grave 4 days, he's not mostly dead, he's all dead. Obviously, there's just nothing Jesus could do. And that's where we'll leave it this morning. I know some of you I can already hear it. It's like, you can't stop here. The story's not finished. And if you're just dying to find out what's going on here, pun intended, you'll just have to read ahead. And if you don't want to read ahead, well, you'll just have to show up next week and find out what happens. But John ends this. This is clearly a section, and the next section moves right on into Jesus' final week in Jerusalem. But he leaves it hanging here. He leaves the crowd's reaction here for this very reason. It's almost like there's a pause in the text because he wants people to say, well, what could he do? Healing's one thing, raising the dead is a whole other thing. And that's why he starts through that thing with Mary and with Martha. Jesus tells her, I am. This gets back to my comment earlier. Jesus doesn't give life and resurrection. He is the life and the resurrection. And if we get that, if we believe that, then we have nothing else to fear in life. If we understand that if we believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and we know that he is the life and the resurrection, there is nothing this life can throw at us. There is no situation that we can get in. This is important to understand. There is no situation that God will put us in that he can't handle. So I pray this week that you will truly live in the knowledge that if you believe in Jesus, life and resurrection are yours. That if we believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, nothing can touch us. Nothing can happen to us that is out of God's hands. And that though we die, we will not. That if we believe, we will live, even though we die, forever and ever into eternity, in God's extended community of love. If you have any needs this morning, please come as we stand and sing.